Anyway, my name is Bill Miller. I work with ESRI. I've been here for 22 years, off and on, mostly on. And I am currently the Director of Geodesign Services at ESRI, and we're the very small group that is one of the evangelical centers for geodesign at ESRI, right? And there are others who are promoting the agenda as well, but we're part of that team. Right? A little over 2 years ago, just before the first Geodesign Summit, I told Jack I wanted to retire for the third time. And I was actually successful this time. I got away for about a year. And then through my big mouth and Jack's compelling tag, I came back to ESRI. Actually, I live down here now. I used to live up in the Seattle area. And so it's been a pleasure to be here for the second time around. But I remember that first conference, I got out of town before it started. And I thought maybe I should contribute my ideas to the subject of geodesign. And so I searched my brain for what those ideas were, and I didn't find very many ideas I could really share with substance. And then last year, the conference, a lot of people presented, and the first year actually was a lot of definition and rhetoric, and the second year was a little more of that with some promise of substance, and this year we tried to provide more content of a substantive nature into the presentations. And also, as I was thinking about the definitions that started to be crafted, worked with Stephen Irwin for a while, and Michael Goodchild, and a number of other people had presented definitions of geodesign. I finally got the courage to formulate my own. And so I'm going to present that to you. It's documented, for better or worse, in the document that most of you have picked up. And I'm not going to go through a formal presentation of this document, but I'd like to have a conversation with you about it, because the thoughts that I have now I would call catalytic as opposed to conclusive. And so they're ideas to initiate or catalyze a conversation about geodesign, what it is, what its extent, etc. And then to take those documents, weave them into this document, which is a draft, eventually have something that we can disseminate as a white paper. But it's going to require your input. So rather than having a presentation, I would actually like to have this as a conversation. And I'll initiate that conversation with some ideas that I think are essential to understanding the notion of geodesign. And you can tell me what you think, and I hope that you'll speak with vitality. And remember that even though I speak as if the word was coming from God himself or herself, right, my ideas are catalytic, not conclusive, and that I've noticed in my own life, almost 72 years of it now, that every time I come up with a really good idea, I document it, I log it, and out of 100 really good ideas, maybe 2 of them are worth considering further. And one of those might actually stick, right? So I got a 1% chance of saying something that's really smart, and you people have to qualify that, right? So where did the word geodesign come from? Okay, let me offer a couple of thoughts. One is as an idea, it really been with us since the beginning of time, I think, because as people, tribal organizations and communities started to design where they live, they considered the geography a place, right? We're going to locate near the river because we have transportation, we have water. We're going to locate in an area that's good for agriculture or hunting, an area that we can defend. And if we make a mistake, we'll move to someplace else, right? And so that idea of designing in the context of your geographic information has been with us since the beginning of time. And the example I like to give, which is documented in here, is the notion of Lloyd Wright designing falling water. How many know the story about how he designed falling water? A few, right? Well, falling water is the house that he designed for Edgar Kaufman on Bear Run. It was a second home, a cabin, if you will. And Wright designed it when he was 64 years old. And prior to that, he hadn't had a major commission for about 2-3 years. But he had his little institute, his educational center, running a lot of students and staff. And they were paying the way, so to speak, while he was waiting for the next project. So Kaufman gives him this commission to design a cabin for their family. And Wright sits on it for 4, 5, 6 months, does nothing. And his entourage are beginning to think, maybe the old guy's lost it, right? Can't do a project, not even in a single house, we have no work to do. So about this time, Kaufman calls. Says, Frankie boy, I'm in town, and I'd come up and see my project, And Wright says, oh yeah, we've been expecting your call, come on up, This was Edgar Kaufman was about 3 hours away from Wright's studio at the time. So Wright hung up the phone and went to work on the design. And his staff stood behind him, sharpening pencils, feeding him lead so he could keep going, So by the time Kaufman arrived, he had the whole house designed, floor plans, sections, elevation, and a small perspective. And of course, Kaufman came up and they went over the project, and it's since become what some say the most famous house in the world, was designed by an architect. So the question I asked you was Frank Lloyd Wright doing geodesign? Someone said yes. Did you say yes? Why?
Because it fits so nicely in the landscape.
Well, let's get a microphone here, right?
Falling water fits so nicely in the landscape, and so all of the elements of the landscape permeate into the house, and it's a delightful place to live, but it meets all the functions that the family needs.
Do we have a counter idea about that? Back up here. Doug? Wait for the microphone, and we'll have it on recorded.
Yeah, I'd say he wasn't doing it. In fact, you could argue exactly the flip side. This is exactly where you shouldn't build, right over the stream.
But building codes are enforced that exactly you wouldn't build there, would you, right? I mean, you're way less than 50 feet from the stream, right? You're on the stream, right? So how many say that he was doing geodesign? You got an idea? How many say he wasn't doing geodesign? Right? How many don't know? How many don't care? Right? Okay. My feeling that he was doing geodesign, right? And the reason is that because Wright had studied the site, and in his mind, while he was designing Falling Water, he understood the geography of the site, he knew where the boulders were to put the foundation, knew how to orientate the building for views and for sun, and he also knew how to capture the cold air that comes down the stream and use that to feed it into the house to cool the house in the summer. Right? So I believe that he was actually doing geodesign in the sense that he was designing in the context of geographic space. He held that geographic space in his head, right? Okay. So how much can you hold in your head? A guy by the name of George Miller, a psychologist, 50 years ago, no relation to me, right? Wrote a paper called The Magic Number 7 plus or minus 2. Anybody heard of this paper before? Right, good, right. Right. And he discovered through experimentation that the average person could remember, manipulate, keep track of 7 things. So we typically have a 7-digit phone number, without the area code. Right? He said if you weren't so bright, you could probably handle 5. He said if you're really smart, you really got it together, you could handle 9. Right? So you think about designing something that has more than 9 variables, what happens? I've seen this in architecture. I'm an architect, so I can speak this way, is that we reduce the problem to the number of variables that we can manage in our head simultaneously, and we design with respect to those variables, and everything else falls in behind that for better or for worse. The classic example I remember is talking to one architect, and he said, yes, this whole design concept is predicated upon this spline here, and all the buildings relate to that spline. Everything else is secondary to that. He could handle 1 variable at a time. Now, I found that I can handle 2 and sometimes 3, right? Architects are, below the lower end of that curve, right? So the aspect of geodesign that's interesting to me is, how do you do geodesign in the midst of complexity, right? Enter the digital age, the use of the computer for storing information that you can't keep track of in your mind, for handling the relationships, for doing mathematically based explorations, right? Whether it be deterministic or stochastic, right? It allows you to extend your thinking, right? Using digital technology so you can handle complexity, right? And one of the things I think that we don't teach in our schools, in our design schools, at least in my experience, is how to handle complexity. We don't deal with that as a subject, right? And so most, say, architectural schools or industrial design schools or landscape architecture schools don't send their students to courses in operations research or systems engineering, where you not only learn the value of systems thinking, but you learn the methodology for handling complexity. So if we can use operations research and systems engineering thinking to get us to the moon, surely we could be able to use that same thinking to design solutions to some of the world's complex problems, right? So this is where I think geodesign gets its value and its importance and its compelling nature is when we move into the domain called complexity. Right? Okay. So I'm going to pause right there and take comments and questions, okay? Now I know you people can handle more than 5 variables, right? Most of you can handle 7, a few of you can handle 9, and here we got one that's going for 4, okay? We need the microphone so we can get it recorded, right?
I thought that the keynote speaker yesterday, framed kind
Can
of.
You hold it up to your mouth like a snow
good?
cone or something, right?
Okay. I thought the keynote speaker yesterday kind of touched on what you were mentioning about systems, and that what we're facing are maybe system failures, and we are measuring them geographically. So when I think of geo, I think of the product of systems that are either our community systems, or as he was mentioning yesterday, water systems or nitrogen systems, phosphorus systems. And then what I'm wondering, or what he seems to be working on, is engineering solutions to those systems. And what I'm wondering, as you're like the principal developer or on the team of Geodesign, is Geodesign going to address systems design and not just spatial design like Carl seems to be proposing, primarily methodologies and frameworks for designing space and new communities.
Right.
But we're looking at a system that we may not even be able to visualize, but we see the results of that system on the landscape. But we've got to redesign something that isn't as easy to map.
Right. Okay. So this is a nice lead into my desire to break down the word geodesign into geo and design, define those 2 terms. Normally I go with geo first, but because of what you said, I'm going to go with the design first, right? So design is the thought process comprising the creation of an entity. I'll say that again. Design is the thought process comprising the creation of an entity. Right? It's a process, not a product. It's thought that includes logic, intuition, insight, the extension of your thinking through use of tools and technology, right? Comprising, I'll get to that word in a minute, the creation, that is the instantiation of something in time and space, right? Instantiation of an entity. What is an entity? 4 types. Actually, there's 5. 4 types. An object that occupies space, an event that occupies time, such as this conference, right? A concept like the theory of relativity, a relationship such as relationship between man and machine, as might be exemplified in the Macintosh operating system. Right? What's the 5th one? The 5th one is a complex entity, because most entities are complex in the sense that they involve 2 or more of those other types. So a book is an object. Okay? You read it in time. You have a relationship with the author or the characters, right? And it often presents concepts that you think about. So a book is a good example of complex entities. Most entities are complex, right? So if you're talking about designing a system, you're dealing with a system of complex entities. So design is the thought process comprising the creation of an entity. Now I'll come back to comprising. It took me 2.5 years to codify this definition for myself. And the most difficult word to come up with, to understand, in that definition was comprising. So what does comprising mean? It means everything that occurs before, during, and after or following the instantiation process. So as an architect, I was trained to design a building. I threw it over the wall to the contractor. The contractor built it, put it together, and then she threw it over the wall to the owner, who then suffered the consequences, right? Along with the users, right? So then you join the software development world, and you design the specs for a piece of code. You write the code, you throw it over the wall to the user, and what happens? It bounces back. It's called tech support, or training, or customer service. And what do? Well, I think I'll make it a little better so I don't have to do so much customer service. And the cycle goes on ad infinitum, right? So you think in terms of the word comprising. As a designer, you're creating the ideas and you're documenting them so they can be constructed by you or someone else or a group of people, right? And then utilized, right? And the thought process comprising the creation of the entity includes the after service once the entity is instantiated. Another example is I had the opportunity as a young man right out of school to work as a structural engineer in San Francisco for 3 years for Stefan J. Medwodowski, Polish engineer. He had the only PhD in structural mechanics in the city. And every project I worked on for 3 years made the cover of Architectural Record or Progressive Architecture. And the last project was Alvar Aalto's library at Mount Angel, Oregon. And it was the 6th in a series of libraries that Aalto did. And I took my students through the library one time and went down to the lower stack. We found the Aalto section. And they had documented all the other libraries he had done. And we went through them one by one. And Mount Angel was the last one. It was the most refined, it was the most aesthetic, it was the jewel, right? So Aalto took responsibility for designing libraries after the library was built by feeding back what he learned into the next one and the next one, right? So that's what I mean by comprising. So as a designer, that means you take responsibility for not only going from the figment of your imagination to some rendition of it, but you take responsibility for getting it instantiated, and you take responsibility for serving it after it's built, right? So design is a thought process comprising the creation of the entity. Now, if you hold to that and you understand the different types of entities, what comes to mind? Well, first of all, we're all designers because we're all responsible at some level for designing the entities around our lives. And if we see ourselves as all designers, what happens when we form a team? We have an architect, we have an engineer, we have a site designer, a planner, a mechanical engineer, we got a client, we got a banker, we got some stakeholder groups, we got some potential users. They're all part of the design team, aren't they? Right? So some of my students will say, well, the banker's not part of the design team. I mean, they just give some money, right? So I say, okay, we have a project, and we plan to spend $5 million on the project. It requires a loan to get it built. And we find out that the banker is only going to give us $3 million. Okay? That decision on the part of the banker affects the physical form of that design far more than anything we do on the drafting table or in our digital geometry, right? The banker is part of the design team. So when we see each other as creators and co-creators, it creates a different dynamic as we create and instantiate the entities that we're responsible for, right? And when you think in terms of a systems problem, which is complex, multiple entities, multiple participants, that's a huge design team, right? They're occurring at different levels, they come and go. In fact, the participants in the design team change over time because maybe someone dies or leaves and has to be replaced. Oftentimes the client representatives will change over time because someone will leave and go somewhere else and someone will fill in, right? You have a very complex dynamic system that you have to design with, right? So we think in terms of how do we do that to solve some of the problems we're facing in this 21st century. They're not small design this park type problems, those exist. The much larger problems like global warming or creating a truce between two nations that are at war with each other, right? Okay, any other comments? Thank you. That help? Okay.
I have a question about, is there a scale or limit? Are there any limits on geodesign? In fact, like, let's take a little piece of packaging that's maybe made from biodegradable plastic or something. Would you call that geodesign? Or where, is there a scalar limit? Or is...
Sure, the example I gave earlier today to somebody was a chair, right? I designed a chair. Is that geodesign? Could it be? Well, let's say you're using exotic wood. Maybe that wood's an endangered species. How much carbon is produced to get that chair constructed, delivered, serviced, resurfaced, recycled, right? So I was thinking, I actually came up in the context of developing a design studio in the School of Design, somewhere architecture or whatever, and that you would give 3 problems, one right after the other. The first would be to design the chair. And it sounds like it's not a geodesign problem, but you ask the students to look at this whole food chain, if you will, from beginning to end and recycling, and look at the carbon footprint of that, right? And the other one would be to design a park or regional plan, which now they're going to feel comfortable with because that's what they thought they signed up for, right? And that's definitely geodesign. Doug Olson's presentation, along with many others, gave excellent examples of that, right? The third one would be to assign this problem. Okay, students, you run a quarter system, you got 13 weeks. We'll just subtract 1 because it takes time to get started and to stop. So we got 12 weeks. Spend the first 6 weeks understanding the problem regarding the conflict between Pakistan and India over the area called Kashmir. Right? And then spend the next 6 weeks proposing 3 alternative solutions that include physical solution, ecological solution, economic solution, religious solution, military solution, political solution as a system, right? Now, obviously, in that period of time, you're not going to get a real solution that the people are going to buy, but you're going to force the students to think through this as a systems problem, right? I assigned a problem like this to my students in Montana when I said, okay, I gave out a letter. It was on fictitious United Nations letterhead, and it said, you've been commissioned to design a building system that could be fabricated somewhere in Western Europe, warehoused there, but shipped to any place in the world within 3 days, and set up within 5 to house a team that would be there for as long as 3 years to look at how to properly develop that area to bring economic, social, cultural, whatever vitality to the area, right? And that you could spend any amount of money to create and put that system in place, but once it's there, it had to be totally self-sustaining. It had to produce its own food, process its own waste, provide its own water, provide its own communication system, provide its own access to transportation, etc. So for the first half of the semester, they studied the 9 biomes on the planet. They studied different types of delivery systems, of how to deliver and then extract a system. Then the last part of the semester, they actually designed a modular system to do that. Only one person completed the problem, but they all went through the thought process to think of that as a system, a fully integrated system, right? Now, I think, you have a question? Or? No. Okay, all right. Okay, right. Go ahead.
Well, I think at that broad scale that you're touching on, an area that geodesign ought to be working or thinking about moving into is climate adaptation. That is a design problem in my mind. It's a strategic design problem.
Right.
And the climate change models are out there, and now it's time for us to think about how we design regions, landscapes, biomes to adapt to ecosystems that we may not be familiar with.
So you should talk with Paul Zwick from the University of Florida, Gainesville, one of our presenters here this morning. He is addressing that problem right now and encouraging others to do the same thing. Thank you. Right. Any other comments? Right. Yes.
Do you think all cultures appreciate this broad definition of geodesign the same? Because in my experience, small, like island nations like Japan and Denmark, there's something in the people that they, probably because of the geography that they live in, they intrinsically understand finite resources, and so they have a higher aesthetic. And it seems to me the way you're talking about geodesign is really taking all the invisible parts of a design and making people appreciate that aesthetically rather than just, googie forms and fun stuff.
I don't quite know how to respond to that. I mean, I'm thinking kind of independent of aesthetics at this point. I'm trying to delineate the broadness of design. I'll talk about geo in a moment. And I've been to Denmark a couple of times, and I'm very aware that they see design as a exportable commodity, right? And the Japanese suck it up, right? And so do we. So I think that there's a propensity on the part of various cultures to look at design differently, right? I remember one time I was in Germany, and I was talking to a design professional there, and I used the word design. They say, "What do you mean?" Well, they had something like 30 words for design, you know. And then we spent the afternoon trying to figure out which one we were talking about, right? So, most often, design is conceived as the superficial quality or aspects of something. It's the geometric sculptural form, plus the how you treat those surfaces with color and texture and things like that. Operationally, it often includes what's behind that, right? And so there's the notion of organic architecture or architecture where form follows function, and the exterior is an expression of what happens on the interior. So all that's a big conversation, right? Okay, and their comments. Yes.
So in trying to figure out geodesign as opposed to just design, could you or anyone else give an example of something that's design but not geodesign? Because it seems that so many things are related to, for example, producing a carbon footprint. So it seems that if that's the criteria for geodesign, I know that's not what you said, but could you give an example of something that's design but not geodesign?
I'm going to let someone else answer that one. Anybody got an example? An idea. Okay.
Doesn't have a carbon footprint.
Okay, the theory of relativity, developed by Albert Einstein, is that geodesign? When you think in terms of the universe, it probably is, right? I mean, if you extend geography to the universe, because it affects our interpretation of how we view the universe, right? So I don't know, it's a good question, right? But I'd like to bring up what it brought to my mind, and that's the definition of geo, right? And thank you. Doug Olson gave us a nice definition of geo. And, but I'm going to morph that into geographic. And if I say geographic space, what comes to mind? Maps? What else? Maps? Landscape? Anything else? Sphere. Okay. Okay. So typically what comes to mind is maps. And they can be flat maps, or if you're really more sophisticated, they're relief maps, right? And then we get even more sophisticated. We drape other stuff on top of that in different levels of transparency, and we have a very nice, complicated, complex, intriguing surface, right? So the geospace, really we think in terms of two-dimensional or two-and-a-half-dimensional environments, right? I present the idea of the geoscape, right? In contrast to geographic space, or as a new way to think of geographic space. Okay. The geoscape is everything that's below, on, and above the surface of the earth that supports life. It's everything below, on, and above the surface of the earth that supports life, all around the planet. So if geospace is now geoscape, right, that's our domain when we think in terms of geographic, right? And we have a broad definition of design as a thought process comprising the creation of an entity, which could be, I'm going to teach you a new word, a cataphrasm. A cataphrasm is a very large gizmo, right? Might even be global in scale, right? So if you think in terms of designing an entity, whatever type that is, right, in our geoscape, that means the domain of geodesign is very broad, right? And especially when you think in terms of geography as not only being physical geography, but cultural geography. So you're dealing with social, cultural, economic, etc. situations that are spatially disposed. This is a whole new way of thinking about geography. So if we can actually digest and get into our bloodstream that we're designers of entities in the geoscape, we have a huge domain of responsibility, right? As professionals and as educators. I've not found a university on the planet yet that is willing to take on that broader domain and teach their students how to be the impresarios of the opera. We're teaching people how to be stagehands, choreographers, costume designers, orchestrators, conductors, ticket takers, promoters, even how to be a good audience. We're not teaching them how to be the impresario that pulls it all together. Right? So I think our design schools need to address this broader problem and teach us how to design the entities that reside in our geoscape. Right? And if we got going, we could spend the afternoon thinking of examples. And I'll give you one that came up last year here. We were asked by the government of Morocco to give them a proposal to redesign the boundary systems for the country of Morocco to better support democracy. That's like asking California to redesign all its county, city, education, fire district, police district boundaries to better support an equitable democracy in California. That's a geodesign problem. Are we teaching people in the School of Landscape Architecture to solve that kind of problem? Or architecture? Or industrial engineering? Or industrial ecology, as Dr. Allenby presented earlier today or yesterday? No, we're not. There's a huge challenge, right? Is there any comment on this notion of geoscape? Now, this is the last one for Fred. We have to move to other people here, right? So wake up and get your hand ready to, right?
I read your paper and I thought it was like the most interesting part of this idea of vertical dimension and the geoscape is, for me, in my mind, what really set geodesign apart from what I would normally call design. So I like it.
Okay, thank you. Right.
Bill, what are the implications legally for geoscape? In other words, how far down does one's property rights go? How far up does one's property rights go? I mean, we're dealing with this with oil extraction and other things below property. So it seems to me the geoscape idea suggests that we need a different kind of legal framework and need to think about what property is.
Exactly, right. I remember when my family first moved to a little town here in Southern California called Tahunga. I subtitled it Rocks and Rattlesnakes, and they paid $6,000 for their house. Can you imagine that? Right? And I remember even at a young age talking to my parents about, well, do we own all the ground? And someone had discovered oil somewhere. Do we own the oil? And they looked, no, we didn't have rights to the minerals, below our, maybe before 3 feet of topsoil. Everything else belonged to someone else, right? And it's just like the Colorado River water does not belong to Colorado, right? Mostly goes to California. We talked about that earlier. Right? Any other comments on this side of the room? Right? Okay, we're giving away a free Prius this afternoon to everyone on the side of the room that asks the most questions. Right now, this side is leading by 7 points. Okay, so you guys are awake over here, right? It's 1 to 7 or 8 right now, right? Okay, right. Anybody else read the paper yet? Okay. Any comments? Microphone.
My thought goes into the direction, I'm a geographer by training, and I'm not trained in the United States, and since I've lived here a long time, I can say my geography training is very different from what students experience in the United States. I very much like the beginning of your paper where you say this has been around for many, for as long as we know about people, because geodesign to me is fitting yourself into the landscape that is there. And when it comes to geoscape, we need to recognize that everything is connected, even though I may own a parcel and I personally claim that everything below and above is mine. I have asked neighbors to cut down their trees because they go growing onto my property. That's my land. So everything is connected, so we cannot, I think that we need to include or be conscious of that when we speak of geoscape, that there is a continuum underneath, there's a continuum in the air, and certainly, of course, on the ground as well. So it is not just this little unit that I can maybe cookie cut out of a map. Right. Or mark on a map. Right. It's a continuous space that I am part of a big thing, the Earth.
Right. Okay, so let's summarize. Geodesign is the thought process comprising the creation of entities in our geoscape. Right? What's missing? Overtime. It's going to take a lot of overtime to solve this problem, right? Okay. What else is missing? Okay. That is included in comprising, right? Now, if you want to heckle from the back of the room, you're all right, but I'd invite you to come down here and participate, okay? Right? He's going to say, I can deduct his salary here later, right? He likes to heckle me. He's one of my former students. Right? What's missing? Yes? Sustainability? That's you're getting close. People? That's even closer. What else? Suitability? Yes? Feedback. Okay, you're all nudging the target. Okay? What is missing is an ethic. How do we know whether or not the design is good or bad? If I say design is the thought process comprising the creation of an entity, how do you know whether your entity is a good entity or a bad entity? The ethic for design comes not from the definition of design, but from the purpose of design, which my contention is always the same, no matter what it is you're designing. The purpose of design is to facilitate life. If your entity facilitates life, it's good. If it inhibits life, it's bad. Does neither is neutral. Very simple, right? Wrong. Very complex. Because what's your definition of life? Whose life? Over what period of time, right? You design goodness for some aspect of life at the expense of some other aspect of life. Right? And I think this is something that's missing often in our challenge to design something, is we don't take time to delineate the design ethic that gives us the ability to measure whether or not what we've designed is good or bad, and to what degree it's good or bad, right? Ethics is just something, we assume it's going to be budget, less than $30 million. That was the budget for this building. We didn't quite achieve that, right? Almost, right? Or it's keep people dry or fed, right? What is the ethic with respect to life? Whose life? This was really apparent to me many years ago when I was working with a young designer who was asked to design a second home ski resort area in the Tahoe area, right? And it was kind of a low-scale development. The developer didn't have a lot of money, but they already owned the land and they could develop. So he designed a hotel on steroids, 12 stories high, as modern as you can conceive of today. And then he convinced his employer that they should go with that. And the employer said, well, how should we present this to the client? I mean, this is all that we need a rendering. And this is before digital technology, right? And so the guy says to David, how much is the rendering going to cost? And David says, it's going to cost $5. So his boss figured $500, right? You know what's going to happen, huh? They got the rendering, it's beautiful, right? Everybody liked it. The rendering cost $5,000, right? And his boss was not happy. I mean, $5,000 in 1971? Okay, right. Why did David design that building and want that rendering? Because he wanted it in his portfolio, right? He wanted to be able to show somebody how sexy he was, right? At the expense of the client, his boss, and everyone else, right? So his notion about goodness was to serve his life, not the life of those who were going to promote the project or even use the project, right? So what's the nature of life? Well, Fritjof Capra, who wrote the Tao of Physics, also wrote a book called The Web of Life. And he points out that all living systems are self-sustaining if they're in relationship with other living systems, right? So there's this connection. And that they use feedback loops, the more intelligent ones, to condition their response to an environment. And some living systems absolutely learn from the feedback and accumulate that knowledge. They don't have to keep getting the same feedback over and over again, right? So this relates to designing something for someone. If you design something for someone that doesn't allow them to self-actuate, probably it's not going to be sustainable as a design because they're not going to be able to do what they want to do with it, right? If you design it so well that they're able to do anything they want to with it, okay, then what happens is that the physical form of that entity disappears, and what they get is total facilitation. That's kind of my personal definition of really good design. If what you design disappears, and what the person gets who uses that design gets total facilitation. So you think about using ArcGIS. You start using it, does it disappear for you? And you're just able to create maps and do overlays and do analysis and sketch proposals and evaluate them without ever having to think about it? Because the program just disappeared? Of course not. No. I mean, you got little warning things flashing up. You got little user interfaces discover. You got to find out where the bird in the cage is, so you can let the bird out of the cage to scare the snake that's guarding the gate to the gold, so you can open the gate with a key that you found under the rug. I mean, there's all sorts of things like that in ArcGIS, right? Why are you laughing, right? It's an adventure game, right? Okay. So this notion about design disappearing is the antithesis of the way I was taught. And the ethic about facilitating life was the antithesis of the way I was taught. So my ethic as a young designer coming out of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, right, was very simple. If I designed it, it was good. If anyone else designed it, it was bad. That was very clear. Right? So you think about if you design something in such a way that the physical form disappears and you get total facilitation, what do I mean by that? Well, if I have a fountain pen, I take it out and I write with it, and it spills ink all over my fingers. That's not too good. That didn't disappear, right? Or I take it out. I bought it last week when I was in Zurich, by the way. It's gold. It's got a little white star in it. It costs $300. And when I take it out, I want everybody in the airplane to see it, right? Now, what was I going to say? Oh, I forgot what I was going to write about. I got so intrigued with my ego and my fountain pen. Oh, well, I'll remember it tomorrow, right? That's not good either. But if I take it out, I put it down, I put my pen back, and all I do is think about my idea and write it down. I even forgot I was using a pen. That's what I mean by disappearing, right? Another example. Let's say you meet someone for the first time. What are you aware of? You're aware of their physical appearance, right? You get to know them a little better. You're used to their demeanor. And you look at their physical nature, and you see that, right? They become a really good friend. What happens the next time you see them? You experience friendship. If you stop to acknowledge their physicalness and what they look like, you get the icon of friendship, right? Designers should strive to create entities that disappear so they create total facilitation for the user as opposed to creating attention getting entities, right? Now, there's some exceptions, right? And you could even argue against these exceptions, but one might be you're developing an advertising program and you want to create a graphic for a magazine that gets attention, right? The one I had when I was much younger, in an earlier age, this can't leave the room, okay? I had a poster this long, this high, that won an award from the New York Graphic Group, their association, because it was advertising an exposition, an exhibit. And it was the frontal view of a naked lady painted with the word exhibit right down in front of it, right? And I had that above my drafting table as a young man, right? I wished I still had the poster, actually, right? Like, put it behind the door, right? But anyway, that poster was designed to get attention, obviously, right, for that thing. So maybe there's some exceptions, right? Any comments on the notion on the purpose of design or this notion of design disappearing? See, it's this side of the room again. Okay.
Bill, I like the idea of design that is graceful, but I'm not sure that disappearing is what I want. And let me offer a contrarian point of view, that a good design is something that invites you to dance with it. Somebody referred to Donald Schoen earlier on, and Don said that designing is a conversation with something. It may be with your iPhone, It may be with your house or your auditorium or your piece of software, but it doesn't disappear. That's like having a conversation with yourself, just talking into the void. You want something that talks back in an interesting and engaging way, that invites new thoughts into the conversation.
Okay, anybody want to add to that? I'll give you my experience with my iPhone. I had a BlackBerry first. I liked it quite a bit. And when I came to work TSRI, they got me the iPhone, so I ditched the BlackBerry, and I didn't know how to use the iPhone. I bought one of these books, iPhone for Dummies, right? I actually never had to read it. But I learned how to use most of the functions I use. And when I use it now, if I'm in a hurry, I just use it. I don't really think about it. But if I'm not in a hurry, I again recognize it. Geez, this is pretty cool, right? And what I'm getting when I recognize it is a symbol of something that really works. And it becomes an example of quality for me, right? So maybe there's this overlapping space between disappearing and dancing, right? And I contend that that's probably so. So thank you, right? Okay. Any other comments about this? Boykin, I want you to say something. Give the microphone to Boykin over here. Right? I want you to say something really intelligent, so you get 3 points for this to bring these guys back into the game, okay? All right, okay, all right. Okay.
So if geodesign is a verb, which I hear a lot, and I agree with, and we generally recognize that the GIS part, the geo part, and I appreciate that you separate them, has to be taught. Does design have to be taught?
How many say yes? You have to teach design. How many say no? Okay. Steve, you want to make a comment?
I think you...
Wait for the microphone. You got to get your exercise here, right?
I need it. I don't know which room, side of the room I'm on here, but...
You're on his side. Right?
All right. Being a fellow Cal Poly alum, Bill and I graduated together, so I do believe that design is something that needs to be taught. Not that we were taught all that well, because it's a continuing process. And one of the things I drew from my earlier life in high school, I went to Hoopa High School in Northern California on an Indian reservation, is the Indian way of thinking is that hey, we're not landowners. The whole concept of land ownership was an utterly foreign concept. But playing into that is that we are stewards of this wonderful earth that we all find ourselves on, and so that lends a responsibility. Oh, good. I could use that.
Is it on?
Oh yeah, here we are. I think it's incumbent on each of us who consider ourselves designers to design with a high level of sensitivity to the environment about us, and I think that's what geodesign is about in my own estimation. And so yes, there are good designs. There are ones that suck because they plunder the earth rather than dance with it.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, Boykin, I think that designers do need to be taught. In fact, if we're all designers, then we all need to be taught how to be co-creators at some level, right? And a lot of us learn that by doing, just by living, right? We're in a situation where we have to resolve a certain problem. We have to get dressed in the morning, select clothes or whatever, however low you want to go with this, right? So I think that design education is very important, and I think that as we think in terms of geoscape, yes, because that's a new idea. As we think in terms of this more holistic view of design, that's a new idea to most people, yes, right? And I think as we think in terms of working with teams and collaborating, yes, because when I was taught design, I was a designer, and you were my client, right? And like Frank Lloyd Wright, when he was working with Kaufman on Falling Water, designed a desk for Kaufman in his study. and the desk was shortened a bit because the way the windows swung into the room to get ventilation, and all the details were worked out. And Kaufman said to Wright, I need a bigger desk. And Wright, who in his contract wrote in clauses like, thou shalt not move furniture without the architect's approval. Right? With that spirit, Wright said it can't be done. And Kaufman said, well, this is hardly big enough for me to write a check to my architect. Wright changed the desk immediately. Right. So I think the challenge is to teach design at various levels, whether it be in first grade or in graduate school, and to teach design in all disciplines, because design is really the third part of three things that every organization does. Right? Every organization, large or small, public or private, does three things essentially. They get and manage information, we'll call that data. Right? They assess that information, evaluate it, analyze it, whatever, for various purposes, we'll call that analysis. Based upon that data and that analysis, they create or recreate goods and or services. And it's the creation or recreation of goods and or services that I call design. Right? And this brings us to the world of GIS, a la ESRI's version anyway, right? Is that GIS technology serves very well the notion of acquiring and managing spatial information. ESRI is the geodatabase, very powerful, it's transactional, it can do all sorts of things, including consume your own custom designed data models, etc. Right? We also offer over 700 functions doing geoprocessing within our software suite. So we're very strong for doing analysis now. Model Builder is an example of the way that you can orchestrate those functions to do different things. Right? Up until recently, we've offered very few tools that allow our customers to create or recreate their goods and or services. Right? Example, the Trust for Public Land was here a few months ago. Bruce Witherspoon was directing their GIS program. They showed us how they create green prints. They gather up data, they overlay it with respect to suitability and vulnerability to identify properties within a certain jurisdiction that are candidates for being permanently allocated as green space. And then they select those candidates, evaluate them, present them to some jurisdiction or NGO who acquires them, and then they get instantiated as protected land. And over the last 20 years, I think they've protected over $6 billion worth of property, right, doing this. Well, they manage all their data in GIS. They do all their analysis and overlays in GIS. When it comes time to drawing the selection part, they plot out a map showing the suitable areas, right? They put a piece of tracing paper over it. They go grab a couple of felt tip pens, and they start drawing in the things they want to protect, right? Their design work falls out of the geographic workflow that's represented by GIS, right? Therefore, you can't assess the depth of goodness or badness of those plans using GIS because it's not in the system anymore, right? So we need to develop the technology that supports the workflows, that's as easy to use as pencil and paper, so that people can create and recreate their goods and or services within this geographic context called GIS, right? And as you can see, we're moving in that direction, but we're not there yet. Last year, when Carl Stannis did his workshop with 9 teams, each team had 3 or 4 people on it. One of them was an expert in GIS technology and our use of our software. Each team was assigned a specific design strategy, exploratory, deterministic, etc. Every team did this. They got the data, they did some analysis, they started to use our tools to design. Within 3 minutes, they were using pencil and paper or pen and ink. Why? Most of the tools that they wanted to use were there, but they were not discoverable, right? They were not sustainable in the sense you open a tool and you want to drop it again, you got to go back and re-find it and reopen it again, right? And so you heard some of the designers present this week, and they say that, look, we need tools that allow us to work instantaneously without any impedance, right? And so we're putting out the idea at ASCRI, at least through our Geodesign Service Group, the concept of zero impedance. Zero impedance-based design tools allow designers to use those tools without any impedance. In other words, the tools disappear, and what you get is the ability to go from the figment of your imagination to some rendition of it with zero impedance quickly, and then you get to assess the goodness of that quickly so you can recycle again. And you do it again and again and again, and this is what you guys do, right, in your office, right? So that's one of the challenges to us, right? What other challenges do you think we have with respect to geotechnology if we think in terms of geodesign as the geoscape and design holistically? What other things come to mind? Currently, yes.
Well, it's not specific.
Let's get a microphone. Sorry, Brent. We'll do 5 more minutes. Right.
It's not specific to GIS technology necessarily, but you made reference to the fact that most universities right now really aren't implementing geodesign. I mean, it's pretty new and that sort of thing. And I like the idea of geoscape, but I think there's the structures of universities and departments, because the geoscape is so complex, we can't handle it, say, within our Department of Landscape Architecture. And so it's something that's very broad and has to be very collaborative in terms of solving these problems. But universities right now really aren't organized to facilitate that.
Right.
And so I think we're going to have to see some reorganization within universities, within departments and colleges to make all of this happen.
Right.
And I think it's going to happen. I think it's exciting, but right now we're not quite there yet.
Right, good. Well, the first thing is to recognize the problem, and thank you for doing that, right? So one thing that, another question or comment up here, Doug?
There was a comment yesterday, someone I was speaking with, and they were talking about the issue of big data, and that we have so much data, so much complexity, that when we start to deal with horizontal and vertically integrated systems, that we need an interface between us and the data that can somehow synthesize and simplify some of the questions. And I think the analogy that I think of is like a GPS. I mean, GPS is using tremendous amounts of data, and yet Garmin's got an interface that says where to your favorites, right? And I think that that's one of the challenges that geodesign faces, that when we're dealing with such interrelated complexity, that and because, as you say, most of us can handle maybe 7 numbers, that's a real challenge. And I'm not sure how you overcome that, but it seems to me that it's that interface, that what you're providing through your software and so on is one of the real areas that really is critical.
Right, that's a big challenge. So there's 3 things that come up here. One is the complexity issue. How does our software handle complexity via interface that allows you to work with it? How does it support collaboration? Because you think about solving a larger complex problem over a period of time, it's going to require more than 1 person on the design team. Let's say it requires 12. Let's say the project is going to last over a year. What are the chances of getting 12 people in the same bricks and mortar space over and over again through that year to get that design out? Pretty low, right? So you have to have a collaboration environment that supports virtual collaboration as well as bricks and mortar collaboration. And we're just now beginning to explore that, right? The thing that you alluded to a little bit, which I was thinking of, was the notion of the 3rd dimension and representing the geoscape with a 3-dimensional extent that includes the atmosphere above the surface and the geology and groundwater, et cetera, below the surface. And that's a 3-dimensional extent. We have no way to represent the atmosphere, such as using 3D grids or voxels, or using that same technology to represent what's below it. Now, some of our customers do, but we don't. And we don't have the ability then to, if we did, to seamlessly move from this environment, voxel-based, to this environment, which might be two-dimensional raster or vector-based, down to another voxel environment, and back and forth and things in between. So when he thinks about 3D GIS, right, having to manage that more complex 3D space, including 3D topology, that's a challenge that we haven't even thought about yet, right? Any other things we should think about? Okay, we're going to close here. I'll take 2 more comments. It's late in the afternoon, right? Give me a coffee or a beer, right? I want to go home, right? Okay. Ben.
When do you think the geodesign process will be ready?
Parts of it are ready now. In total, 10, 20 years. Right. Not because it couldn't be done faster, you know, right? There's a lot of inertia, right, that we have to overcome. Okay, one more comment. Okay, I want to thank you for your time. I've enjoyed the conversation, right? And if you have trouble sleeping at night, read the white paper, right? Guaranteed, 3 minutes, you're asleep, okay? Right, thank you very much. Do we have audio on it?
The Nose Creek watershed. Currently undeveloped. We've run a number of vulnerability and suitability analyses on the site and combined them to come up with some layers that will help us site new development. This is our vulnerability layer, where 1 through 9 indicates low vulnerability to high vulnerability. In addition to that, we have a suitability layer, which, again, 1 to 9 indicates low suitability and high suitability for development, and that considered proximity to existing transit and roads. What else did we put in that one?
Okay, this is being done by a planner, not a GIS person. He's been on the system for 15 minutes.
In northern Calgary. It's a big selling point. We've boiled the vulnerability analyses down into 4 maps where we look at the terrain suitability. These 4 went into the vulnerability. Terrain suitability, habitat suitability, ecological infrastructure, and agricultural suitability. And these layers are going to act as constraints and help us site the development. Additionally, just some base layers on in the background. We have the existing road network, highways, and this is one of the bus rapid transit routes in Calgary, and it's heading north here. So looking at this map, there's a coincidence of low vulnerability and high suitability for development at this intersection here, and coincidentally, it is also on the road that currently has bus rapid transit. So we're going to focus there for our new development. So what we'll do is zoom in. We'll bring in some of these constraints layers just to keep us focused on where we should and should not be siting new development. We're going to use terrain, habitat, and ecological infrastructure, and we're going to ignore agricultural just for this demonstration. So what we start with is, essentially placing our center of our development, which will be right at the intersection of these roads. And at that center, we're going to put a bus rapid transit station. So once we have that center defined, we'll just zoom in a little bit more here and begin to define our range of intensity of uses, which go from an urban core, high intensity, down to rural intensities. Each one of these contains a mix of uses. That'll be our second sketching exercise. But for now, we just identify the range of intensity of uses. So we'll start with urban center, and we'll just draw a little area, a zone, just the center here. And let's just zoom in a little bit more. So we'll be able to see this site a little better. So our urban core is at this intersection with our bus rapid transit. Around that, we'll just loosely sketch in an urban area. And there's some existing development to our west here that we're going to avoid. But our urban development will kind of straddle these roads and avoid some of these constraints that we've identified. Around that, we'll do the same with suburban development. Just being careful to avoid the constraints. Let's try that again. Additionally, most of this area is what we could call rural, so we're just going to highlight that. But still around the constraints, and that'll include existing development, which is rural. We're going to call out these constraint areas as being natural, so that's our intensity is natural, which essentially says we're not going to develop there. So what we have is our gradation from high intensity to low intensity down to preserved natural areas. So yeah, what we can do is turn off the constraints, and we'll just work within our developed areas here. All right, so we have our gradations of development intensity around the transit node, and we're going to start placing uses. So the uses here there's not an intensity defined per use. We already defined that with the broad scale gradations. So around the core here, we'll create a retail commercial mixed use area just around that bus stop. And then around that, we'll loosely identify a retail residential land use, and that'll go along the major roads here. Let's try that again. Hold on. I'm doing that over here anyway. Okay. There you go. Okay. Okay. Go ahead. All right. Yeah. All right. So we'll identify that mixed-use residential area. Okay. So that's where roughly our multifamily will go. Around that, we'll put single-family attached units, and we'll keep things close to the road and in the areas we've identified, not as natural, but for development. And just follow that up on the south end. And then just to kind of buffer our mixed core here, we'll just put some multifamily residential. Okay. So with that, we've established a mixed-use core here that goes out to residential. Our previous layer, the intensity planning, establishes how intense each of those uses are. So not only are we going from a core of commercial uses and mixed uses to residential, we're going from high intensity to low intensity. And just to round this out, we'll add these bus routes and some roads to show the beginning of the structure of the development. So our bus route will run down towards our existing route. And we'll begin to sketch in.
We're out of time, but that's pretty much the video. We're going to post that online with Doug's permission. His team came to work with us for 4.5 days. Well, we did a little studio work together, and it was a great working with your guys, Doug. You're really outstanding people. And, but I think you can get to see what I mean when I talk about geodesign, designing in geographic space, where you have all the other information that's referenced to that space available to you as a designer, as reference as you design, or for doing an assessment of your design once it's been completed, right? So again, thank you for your time. I pretty appreciate it, and